Welcome to the PI Podcast. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co host, political scientist, meme lord, and visiting fellow of the Anthony Hopkins School of Medicine,
What
Borge.
the? Okay, I am not Hannibal. Well, I do like to be Hannibal.
It's a visiting fellowship.
PI nyo, PI nating lahat, board here at your service.
Yes, and welcome to episode 7. And this is a special episode. Why is it special, Borge?
Woo, we have a special guest for tonight.
Yes, we made a decision. We're expanding the PI family. And it's a friend of the podcast. And not only is it our first interview, but it is also our first episode of the PI Film Institute, as in PI as in Film Institute. So yeah, PI yan. And we're talking about films because we all like watching films.
Mm.
But in particular, Philippine films, yung mga pelikulang Filipino. So Borge, what's your experience with Filipino films?
Oh, okay. Regarding that one, I think minimal to an extent, minimal, but
Mhm.
enough to rub my belly and warm my heart, or
Mm,
give me sleepless nights.
okay. Well, actually, tamang-tama kasi we're going to publish this in December. This is the month of, let's see, yung MMFF,
Oh yeah,
Metro
yeah,
Manila
yeah,
Film
yeah, yeah.
Festival. So it's that season. But
Yep.
today, we're going to talk about a particular genre, which is about romantic comedies or rom-coms. And yun ang
Aroy.
paborito ng mga Pilipino, di ba?
Yeah.
Yun. And so, he's a deep consumer of Philippine films. So let me just read this bio note. All right. So Janus Nolasco is managing editor of Asian Studies Journal of Critical Perspectives on Asia, published by the Asian Center, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Comparative Literature from UP Diliman and majored in West Asian Studies for his master's degree in Asian Studies at the UP Asian Center. He is the author of Between Philippine Studies and Filipino American Studies, the Trans-Pacific as Area and Transformation of Area Studies in the 21st Century, published in Savanabhumi, Multidisciplinary Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. So yes, he is an expert in Asian studies. So everyone, mga kapi-ay, please
Mga
welcome
kapiyan.
our first guest, Janus Nolasco. Woo!
Woo, woo.
How are you, Janus?
Hi,
Kumusta?
thanks, Matt. Thanks, Borge. Ramat, for inviting me here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good
Okay.
to finally share my
Mm-hmm.
thoughts on rom-coms.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice, nice,
Be
nice,
happy to
So,
nice.
share my ideas, no?
Yep.
of course. Anyway, so Janus, just to start off, so how did your journey as a researcher begin? Let's start by getting to know you.
Thanks again for inviting me, no? But first of all, I just hope that the audiences can learn something from my discussion. No?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, I hope that I can learn from this discussion and the questions that you will ask, and
Yep.
of course from the comments from the
Mm.
audience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in Facebook, I hope there will be some comments or critiques about
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
at the very least, I seek to contribute to an ongoing dialogue on Philippine studies.
Mm-hmm.
As for my career in Philippine studies, no, I wasn't really trained in that aspect. But
Mm-hmm.
as you said, my MA was on Asian studies, so
Mm-hmm.
focusing on West Asia. But over the years, I just slowly, gradually drifted back to the Philippines. No?
Mm-hmm.
Not least because we have so many pressing issues to deal with as a nation. No,
Mm-hmm.
not that I'm abandoning my love of Asian studies, but at the same time, I also felt that I was missing out, and there was this
Mm.
nagging feeling, especially over the last several years, that the issues of the country should concern me first. Of course, this should not mean an either or. No, we're not supposed to choose
Mm.
between Asia or the Philippines. Studying Asia can also shed light on and offer lessons for the Philippines.
Mm.
For example, sometimes what seems normal for the Philippines becomes less so when viewed in a comparative context.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
And another example is we can see the Philippines as part of Southeast Asia,
Mm.
especially in terms of value systems.
Yep.
But I digress. We're here to
Mm.
talk about films.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes.
all right.
Yes.
Yes. So, what is your precise interest in the field of out of all of Asia? So, we're connecting the Philippine culture with the rest because we are Asians after all. People
Yeah.
forget that.
Yeah.
But
Matt looks the
yeah,
most Asian.
yeah. Well, we'll see about that. But yeah, what are your precise interests?
Um, of course, West Asian studies with emphasis on pre-modern history and Islamic studies in particular.
Mm.
So for my MA, I learned to read and write some Arabic
Ooh.
Oh
and a
wow.
little Farsi too.
Oh.
Mm,
And my undergrad in UP was in literature, so
mm-hmm.
literary theory. So I dabble in that, Asian studies, philosophy, and intellectual history, then political thought and cultural studies in general, and of
Hmm.
course
Mm-hmm.
pop culture, especially
Yeah.
romantic film. And
So.
as an area studies major, I see the value in really read up on the different social sciences and
Mm.
uh, the humanities. No?
It's very multidisciplinary.
Yep.
It's very
Yeah.
I say Renaissance man. Wow, it's
Hmm.
amazing. But now let's talk about like because we decided to get you on this show, particularly with your interest in films. You've written works on deeply analyzing blockbuster films. But so what made you decide on writing on Philippine films?
Uh,
Hmm.
well, it's not really deep analysis, no. So it's just few essays here and there, no.
Hmm.
But excuse me. But I've always watched popular Filipino films, just
Hmm.
as a hobby, somewhat since the
Hmm.
80s. But eventually began to see them differently as I
Hmm.
studied, as I
Hmm.
absorbed these theories and all of that.
Hmm.
Today,
Hmm.
I just hope to cultivate some level of appreciation for
Hmm.
or understanding of these films, or at the very
Mm.
least, help reduce the bashing they get in some quarters.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
Of
yeah,
course,
because mhm.
all of us are well within our rights to dislike a film, no? Filipino film, any other film
Hmm.
for that matter. And
Mhm.
taste and preference is not something that you can really legislate.
Hmm.
Mhm.
If one doesn't like the film, I mean that's fine, di ba?
Hmm.
Mhm.
So I'm not saying we shouldn't criticize rom-coms, no?
Mhm.
So we can do so on content or technical grounds, for instance.
Mhm.
Or I'm not saying that we should be content with what we have.
Hmm.
Mhm.
But of course, we
Because
can function in
mm,
the cinema or other forms of, other movies. But at the
mhm.
same time, I think we should at least understand why our romantic films are the way they are.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right.
and not just dismiss them wholesale.
Hmm.
Yes. Because let me just contextualize first because in the Philippines this is the most popular genre and
Hmm.
it still earns billions of pesos not just here in the Philippines but also for OFWs, overseas Philippine workers
Hmm.
around the world, and they earn money around the world, but they tend to be, at least according even to the scholarly intellectual class or even the middle class, to be very shallow, to be very mundane. uh, you share this observation board,
No,
hence like you're
regarding
not exactly
no, the thing is that
updated. Yeah.
no, it's not about me being outdated on such thing. The thing is, Filipino society. I think we can discuss this later on. Filipino society is a very romantic
Hmm.
society. So the
Hmm.
proliferation and
Mm.
the persistence and the development of rom-coms, I think, reflect our growing sense of
Hmm.
sentimentality and our developing sense of romance. Just it is
Hmm.
as it is. I'm not going to say anything else. It is as it is.
Hmm. Right. It's good that we have people like Janus here who are able to
Yeah.
see something deeper. I mean, it's
Mm,
not so deep, but deep enough to make you
mm,
think.
mm.
And may I ask Janus, like, ano ba yung unang pelikula na nakita mo? Gusto ko, I want to write something about this. What made you want to write? Like, which film is that?
Uh, One of my favorite uh, romantic films, rom-coms, and started really in the 90s, no, with
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Sana Maulit Muli.
Ay.
Sana
Not
maulit
exactly
muli. Sorry.
comedy. So this is
Mm.
1995, I think, if I'm not
Mm-hmm.
mistaken. And then a few movies by Marvin and Julina.
Ay,
Ah,
classic, classic.
Uh,
yeah.
the thing is, I watched it first, and then after I studied, my BA and MA, that's
Mm.
when I really began to see, I
Mm-hmm.
look back and came up. I can't really pinpoint the exact moment, no, but
Mm.
I just eventually realized that
Mm.
these recurring themes and problems in some Philippine movies, no.
Mm.
So then,
Mhm.
especially now, and then eventually when the new batch of rom-coms came,
Mm.
then
Mhm.
eventually, I just came together, so to speak.
Oh,
I
okay.
just okay, so and then I got to watch a lot, several, and then I did notice these certain trends, no, and continue with this from the 90s and so
Mhm.
on. Yeah.
So
Mhm.
parang love story lang 'yan. Hindi na napapansin, bigla na lang sasampal.
Yeah.
Ay, wow! Ang
Yun yung
galing
Yeah.
nun.
All of this was on the side. No, I wasn't
mm.
really, because when I was doing my MA, I was studying the
Mhm.
movies, diba? Yeah.
Mhm.
So, but it's that's how it came to be for me.
Mm.
No? So
Right.
I
Mm.
wasn't only watching rom-coms. No, I was already also watching, sa cinema one in the 90s. No,
Mm.
Cable. So all of these films really stuck with me.
Mm. Yes.
Of course, I
Okay.
did watch maybe I still,
Mhm.
yeah.
Right. Mm.
One milestone. I mean, I never really thought about this. No, so one
Mhm.
milestone I would say would be when I wrote a review. I think that's
Mm.
when it really started. I would say
Starring Derek Ramsey and sino ba? Isa yung babae dyan?
Janeline Mercado.
Jan and Mercado, yes.
So
I
that was
related so much.
that was the first
Mhm.
Mm.
uh, real essay that I wrote and was published in Kyoto Review of
Mm.
Publication. Yeah.
Right. So
Sige.
English only, please.
English only, please. The story is Derek Ramsey. I forgot his name in the film. No, the character of
Mhm.
Derek Ramsey. His girlfriend broke up with him with via letter in Filipino, no, Tagalog.
Mhm. Right.
So, and then he needed to translate it. So he had to hire somebody to translate it for him. And the person that he hired was Jeneline Mercado. So,
Mhm.
and then from there, so eventually he came to the Philippines, and then they met, and they developed into a relationship,
Mhm.
and then they ended up together. Sorry for the
Mhm.
spoiler. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a rom-com, so we all know the happy ending. But let me ask you this. I mean, I think you noticed English, like speaking only English, represents a kind of a class division in society where, di ba, yung mga konyo, yung mga mayayaman na nag-English, and ganyan yung mga characters in Derek Ramsey. And then, of course, representing the normal Filipina, it's si
Mm.
Janeline. So what does this say to you socially or politically? What did you see with this story?
This is I think remembering my review right now, no. So
Mm.
basically, this is about the Philippine society. So of course, the film is about Filipino identity, no? Because this is about how the character of Derek Ramsey became or grew to really love the Philippines, no? And he
Mm.
was able to do this, by he was like translating his American background. I think he's half Filipino in the film, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So and then he eventually appreciated, he came to love the Philippines more, no?
Mm-hmm.
So this is really about from the perspective of the homeland, the Philippines. This is really about, among other things, I have a review about this, no? So people
Mm-hmm.
can read it. So
We'll put a
this is
link. Yeah.
yeah, this is about sorry, uh, accommodating the Filipino foreign, no?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, for us, what's Filipino is, the speaking the language, because there are scenes about this, in the movie,
Mm.
no? So you know, generally speaking, this is about the relationship between the Philippines and the diaspora or the migrants in the United States or elsewhere. In this particular case, in the United States. So the question of Filipino identity is tackled in this film, among other things. No. So the explicitly political dimension will have to come when when the film talks about because Jeneline Mercado, the character of I emphasize the character of Jeneline Mercado,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is contributes a lot to, she sends money to her family in the province, no.
Mm-hmm.
So and then she's the, if I remember correctly, she's the breadwinner talaga. Siya yung nagbibigay
Mm-hmm.
ng pera. And
Mm-hmm.
then the problem is that she was supposed to be sending money for the renovation of their house, but when
Mm-hmm.
she returned home one time, the house was still not it wasn't renovated. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this question of there's this nagging feeling in the film that she'd be better off without her family in the
Mm-hmm.
book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's this culture of dependence that we will talk about later.
Mm.
Right, right. It's like a classic story between rich guy with a simple girl, which is part of an old trope that still can be seen in American cinema. And I don't know if you can comment on this, but the rom-com itself, romantic comedy, is an American invention, or parang important siya eh. And we kind of adopted that, just like
Yes,
this
of
one,
course.
yeah.
Yeah, we would discuss this later, no?
Mm-hmm.
But yes, because we take on our stories, no?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, in the film, it's not really a simple girl because the character of Jeneline Mercado there is, she's a professional,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
she's earning quite she's earning some money. So this is not your poor, typical poor,
It's a fantasy of the
yeah,
poor.
simple girl. Yeah, and she's not poor, no? She's
Mm.
probably middle class. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not your typical poor girl meets, yeah. Of course, that's what I like about the film. It has a lot of levels.
Mm.
Talaga.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with regards to rom-com, the thing is, in this place of cinema society of Philippine cinema, rom-com tends to be like we mentioned earlier, the most looked down genre. But the thing is, um, I mean, if there is no shortage of intellectualized and crafted films, and I
Mm.
think there are a lot of like master filmmakers, Vilente Mendoza, Lav Diaz, etc. And yet you choose to focus on these mainstream films. So perhaps can you maybe comment on this the early divide, because now that they're smarter and crafted films now in the mainstream, but maybe uh, in the past, maybe you can talk about this divide. Why is there this divide between indie films, which can be politicized and intellectualized, and the mainstream romantic comedy?
well, I'm not in the best position to talk about these broader questions about Philippine film. No?
Mhm.
So I can just share my thoughts on the
Sure.
rom-com per se. So no, this is really my analysis on rom-coms per se. So because that question about the divide between the indie and the rom-coms is something that's really beyond my expertise. But I think
Hmm.
my reading, because in trying to show how rom-coms are very political, I try to challenge this dichotomy between the serious quote unquote the
Hmm.
political films and the
Mm.
rom-com,
Mm.
which are often, I think, that they're not really thought of as political, like
Hmm.
in the sense of a Mike De Leon film or something.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to like maybe your method. So how do you read them politically, and what do you think is the general relevance of the rom-com to the, say, to
Understanding.
politics, really?
Yeah.
Because this is a primarily political oriented podcast, so
Mm.
maybe our readers might want to know, what does this have to do with politics? So what do you think?
Okay. My reading focuses really on the stories, no? and
Mm-hmm.
the plot, I would say, and the dialogue. Because why is it that this is the kind of dialogue that we have, the quotes and the problems that the characters have, no?
Mm.
So my reading in general is that many of these romantic films seek to challenge the, what could be called the feudal, patron-client hierarchical relationships typical of Philippine society. In these films, there is no call to revolution, or a clear
Mm.
indictment of the social order. It's nothing like that. But there's a sort of pushback, pa rin.
Mm.
So to elaborate on this point, we have to foreground one aspect of Philippine society. Of course, there will be some simplification here, but since no society can ever be painted in black and white terms.
Mm.
But I think there is generally, I would like to think that there is no full-blown individualism in the Philippines.
Mm.
Certainly not the kind you see in the United States. Except perhaps for some segments.
Right.
And generally, all of this is mediated and affected by one's social class, one's earnings.
Mm.
All of this. Well, anyway, in the Philippines, the family still plays a large role in shaping one's decisions. Yeah, and this somewhat undercuts autonomy, independence, and self-determination. And also, our society really respects hierarchies a lot. So much so that criticizing our elders and superiors often meets disapproval. Think of the lines na sumasagot ka na ngayon or yeah, tutod ka na lang, di ba? And consider as well yung line na habang nasa pamamahay kita, ako masusunod, And incidentally, there's this commentary on quote unquote toxic Filipino culture, no? So this is a essay by Michael Bailosis. So I will quote him. Quote, the hierarchical structures of our families also make our relationships feel a lot less democratic. It is considered rebellion to speak up and voice an opinion toward an elder. Submission to patriarchs is an exception. Laughably, it is bad manners for children to talk back to parents. But the same is true when we are dead silent. End quote. And another example of our lack of individualism is a culture of dependence, created by, among other things, migration. Since kuya or ate are sending money, one can just expect to receive a monthly allowance. This generally discourages people from striking out on their own. Think, for example, of the status of Joy, played by Catherine Bernardo in Hello, Love, Goodbye.
Oh, it's a good one.
She's the only, if not the main provider for her family back home in the Philippines. And something similar goes for Teresa Madlansakay in English. Teresa is the one played by Jeneline Mercado. Anyway, all of these hierarchies and this culture of dependence are reflected and then challenged in different ways in romantic films. Just like to give a few examples. We don't have time to go through each individual plot, but I'll quote some lines. Pardon the spoiler alerts.
All right.
Okay. For example, in The Day After Valentine's, Bella Padilla's character, Lani, tells Kai, is played by JC Santos, ako ang umayo sa'yo, so akin ka. Something to that effect. So this was Casey was at a vulnerable point in his life when he met Kai was at a vulnerable point in his life when they met, and he recovers thanks to Lani. There's a long story, but that's how what happened. So in this line, you already see a sort of invocation of utang na loob, or the dependence that entails ownership and thus domination over someone. You don't really own somebody. Akin ka, di ba? So part of the movie's lesson is that this kind of relationship should not be so. So they never end up together. Again, sorry for the spoiler.
Yeah. So if I can comment on the pattern of your work. So what I noticed is that not only are you trying to identify essential parts of Filipino culture or Filipino life or Filipino identity, but you're also paying attention to power relations,
Hmm.
and at least what a lot well what seems to recur a lot is in two main themes. Number one, hierarchies and class, which might be a bit Marxist, and boards
Hmm.
might pick up on that also. But at the same time, and I think this is true with a lot of your own work and other articles that you've written on democracy, really. So and how it contributes to democratic agents, as well as how it hybridizes or mixes with our Filipino identity. Do I have that correct, or do you have anything to
Yeah,
add with that?
yes, yeah. So there is really a connection here between the rom-coms and the values that they espouse are really, implicitly promoting, some values of liberal democracy,
Mm, yes.
self-determination, equality.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Basically, it's these films try to reconstruct relationships on a more equal basis, no?
Hmm.
Right.
So I can give more examples to prove the point, no?
Right.
It's just one film.
Sure. I think we're well. Before we move on, Borge, do you have anything
Hmm.
to ask Janus, or maybe talk about, let's say, as a Marxist, maybe Marxist theory in
No, no, no,
film?
no.
You
It's
know,
not really a
yeah.
Marxist theory, but dovetailing on what Janus said a while ago, I think the rom-coms, as far as the plots are concerned, by espousing liberal democratic ideas, what they did, as far as what I've watched, they exposed certain tensions between our own traditional culture
Mm-hmm.
and that struggle to have self-determination, to be individualistic, so on and so forth. So I think, yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
by espousing such ideas, correct me if I'm wrong, they instead show
Mm-hmm.
tensions between those ideas and actual or the status quo.
Mm-hmm. If you notice, like, I think let's move on, like, from the traditional rom-com, which talks about Filipino family, which talks about these hierarchies. Now I think there is a shift with the rise of not only indie films but smarter mainstream films, through particularly through the productions of black sheep. You know, things like Alone Together and Excess Baggage, etc. So had like, and I noticed that shift because it somewhat subverts the rom-com expectations. It's no longer a happy ending, but it kind of actually, spoiler alert for a lot of these films. Sabi nga ni Ramon Bautista, kaiba ng mainstream tsaka indie or yung mga or new mainstream, hindi na silang nagkakatuluyan, or they don't end up together. The guy does not get the
Mm-hmm.
girl, etc. So I wonder if you can highlight this shift, which might be related to liberal democratic values or the change in like culture in these days.
I would say that, okay, so we've established that the films espouse the values of liberal democracy, no?
Mm-hmm.
Autonomy, independence, And
Mm-hmm.
this is really reflected in, as you said, a key formal change in the film.
Mm-hmm.
That more and more romantic films today
Mm-hmm.
do not have a happy ending. This is
Mm-hmm.
because audiences today are jaded. They don't believe
Yes.
it. They're really wary of happy endings. That doesn't happen in real life, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
also because liberal democracy demands singlehood. No, so
Mm.
you can
Mm,
quote that line.
wow. That's quotable. The liberal democracy demands
Uh,
singlehood. Interesting.
because when you're single, you've no choice but to keep pursuing your passions. And this is what
Mm.
happens in the rom-coms. They're forced to. It's interesting to know that rom-coms will always dangle the promise of happily ever after. It's part
Ah.
of the genre,
Mm.
and then they
Mm-hmm.
just yank it away. As if somehow forcing people to be single and
Right.
thus free. So there's a little existentialism for you there. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, couplehood and independence are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
As some of the rom-coms today, as I mentioned, they aim to reconstruct the basis of relationships
Mm.
beyond dependence. I can mention other films if you need.
But the top, what, two maybe? Like,
Sige. Sige, Alone Together, since it's one of the more famous ones, no?
yeah.
Because in Alone Together, there's this line, Christine, played by Lisa Soberano, tells his
Mm-hmm.
boyfriend, sorry again for the spoiler alert, ha? Ayoko na, I want
We'll put
out.
that in the link. Yeah.
Tama na, it's over. You saved me, I served you. You support me, but not enough to make me fly.
Mhm.
I am a child, but why do I feel so old? Hindi ko nakakilala ang sarili ko. I should be dreaming, conquering the world. But I built my life, career, my dreams around you. End quote. Okay?
Mhm.
So, you already see that their relationship somewhat echoes the dependence of a person on a patron, you know?
Mhm.
And how the relationship erases her individuality. So, Christine breaks up with her boyfriend to
Mhm.
pursue her dreams. And at the same time, never ends up with her true love. So
Mhm.
again, there's that part about the breaking away from the happy ending movie. No? And then
Mm.
another thing is in Isa Pa with Feelings, Gali, played by Carlo Aquino, had an ex-girlfriend who told him, "Am I your yaya?" So the context of this quote, this question was Gali is deaf, by the way. So and he
Mhm.
was expecting her now ex girlfriend to translate for her all the time when they when they have company. So
Mhm.
because as a deaf person in the film, Gali feels left out. But and so this is what she tells him: "Do you expect me to attend to you all the time?" Something like that.
Mhm.
So, and
Right.
am I your yaya? So, and
Mhm.
this is the reason they broke up. So, but with Mara, played by Maine Mendoza, his relationship is one of
Mhm.
equality. So, Gali is worried
Mm.
that their differences will affect their relationship. But she
Mm.
says, Mara says, then I will be deaf for you. So, this is significant because although the woman, yet again, will sacrifice
Mhm.
herself, their relationship is now based on equality and a shared
Mhm.
vulnerability. Feminists have
Mm.
some interesting insights on vulnerability and its relationship to moral philosophy. And to symbolize their equal relationship, the film ends with them dancing together, highlighting their teamwork. Actually, throughout the film, they do help each other a lot. It's not the usual
Mhm.
one-sided relationship where one is the martyr. As it is
Mm.
say in the first half of The House of Us, starring Catherine Bernardo and Daniel Padilla.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah,
Do you have anything to add,
these
Borge?
are
Yeah.
these are fantasies. These are things that people want to do, and if we are going
Mhm.
to apply it to issues on power relations at a large level, then this becomes a more a spectacle of an ideal that we don't have.
But just because, like as you mentioned, certain movies doesn't have happy endings,
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's not fantasy. It's just another
Yeah.
kind of fantasy, don't you think?
No,
I
but
mean,
yeah.
mm,
Yeah, I need to add one thing. Something that I remembered. I think regarding the dissolution of patron-client relations, I think that's already part of the literature right now. That democracies or unconsolidated democracies right now are experiencing a change in patron-client relations. So before it was
mhm,
thoroughly vertical and dependent, but for now, recent developments have allowed clients to have a leverage. So it's also reflective of a general shift in public affairs that the
mm,
clients are no longer that dependent on patrons at this point, unlike during the
mhm,
70s and the 80s.
mhm,
So yeah, there's something to reflect on.
mhm. And it's not just a shift in the relations between classes, but also between the sexes. Like
Mm.
particularly in Lone Together, if you notice, it's the woman that becomes more independent and conquers her and fulfills her dreams. And I think that's what I think that's what subverts what we can call the post-romcom. Because in a rom-com, the ideal is the couple getting together. But here it's like what Janus is saying, it's the individual that is paramount, or it's celebrated here, which again is a liberal democratic ideal. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
of course the film does not really talk about liberal democracy
Yeah,
per
yeah,
se.
yeah,
They
yeah,
don't
Of
yeah,
course.
expose
yeah.
democracy.
Hmm. Right.
But the
Hmm.
values they expose, singlehood, pursuing your passions, these are, forms of self-care, di ba?
Mm,
Hmm.
You attend to yourself first, you
mm,
love yourself. So there's
Mm.
already implicit,
mm,
take care of the self. It's, you're not, you have to take care of yourself. You have to look after yourself.
mm.
Of
Uh-huh.
course, you're free to love somebody, but if it
Hmm.
doesn't work out, there's still you to take care of, di
Mm.
ba?
But
Oh.
they're also showing the costs na ang kailangan mong bayaran para magawa yung mga ganung bagay, which is more or less to lose your
The-
true love, quote unquote.
or your
Yeah,
romantic ending. Yeah.
of course, not all, again. We have to emphasize that not all rom-coms today,
Mm.
end up, they all end up single. There's still that part. There's still that dream that
Hmm.
things will turn out okay. Like in Isa Pa with feelings. So it's
Right.
not just about single. Not I'm not saying everybody should be single. It's more of that's just but
Yeah.
what the films are saying is we have to reconstruct the relationship on a more equal basis. Siguro for this part, I think there is really a connection between love and equality, no?
Mm.
Mm.
So normally we think of love as romantic and all of these things, but
Mm.
there is this connection between the two. So for
Yeah.
Mm.
instance, in a book called God Still Matters, uh,
Mm.
the Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe, he talks about love in general. This
Hmm.
is his idea about the connection between love and equality.
Mm.
Oh, love then is between equals. To love is to give to another, not possessions or any such good thing. It is to give yourself, which means providing a space in which the other can be himself or himself. Love is rather rare and comes with maturity when we can get away from the need to be dominant or to find another who is not dominant.
Yeah,
This is
and
stage. If you love someone, set them free. You know, this is not just so based on what we're talking about. This is not just something you say when somebody breaks up with you, doesn't
mm.
love you, like
Yeah.
you.
Mm.
It also applies even if you're in a relationship.
Mm.
Hmm.
They say, wag mong sakalin,
Mm.
literally and figuratively. So
Hmm. Hmm.
just think of the reason why Basha and Popoy broke up in One More Chance. Diba?
That's another classic film. Yeah.
And it echoes earlier ideas like Eric Fromm's examination of human love.
Mm.
Love for Eric Fromm is about letting the other be creative or to create him or herself, and that requires freedom. So yeah, I think McCabe more or less echoes Fromm's earlier ideas, which is very close to me as far as I'm concerned. So yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, and if we can deviate a bit from films, but I think this is an interesting aside. The fact there's a relationship between love and politics. Like, is love a political emotion? And I think one thing that Hannah Arendt would say is the only kind of political love that she would consider as ideal for political is, friendship, which is
Mm,
a love between equals.
mm,
I'm not sure if you're prepared to comment on that, but I think that's what I've noticed. And in fact, in a lot of the films that you are doing, it's either there's several circumstances when either one they are well they're one is over the other, so one
mm,
is happy, the other one is not as happy, or they're both happy separately, or
mm.
they're happy together even for a short time. Which I think I think this is, I don't want to spoil another ending for another movie. uh it's the what's that? Hello, Love, Goodbye, which I think is the current highest grossing. Like, it's not, it's quite in between happy and sad. They were able to live out their fantasy, but albeit temporarily. But do you have anything to say about that with regards to love as a political emotion? Because for Arendt, she says that Eros is just, which is, it's not political precisely because it is isolated between two people in a fantasy. It's and I think in another discussion he said that it's stuck in time, which means it does not grow, it doesn't move forward.
Mm.
So yeah. So what do you think about that? Is love, or even romantic love, can it be political or something? What are you talking
Well, I'm not an expert on the philosophy of love, no? But I can comment on film, no? Hello, Love, Goodbye.
right,
The
right.
key line there is because they had fallen in love already, and then sorry again for the spoiler alert to those who haven't watched it. And there's this line that Joy, Catherine Bernardo's character, says, "If you love me, why are you making me choose?"
Mm,
So again, there is this: the woman is being forced to abandon her dreams because
Mm.
Joy wants to have a better life somewhere. Eh.
mm-hmm,
So again, that's the part that the individual will have to come first. It's me who will have to win out. It's not
Mm.
the relationship. Of course, the film does not deny that she loves him, diba? But
mm-hmm,
there's that part that what's more important for Joy and this is where the liberal democracy
Mm.
comes in.
Uh-huh.
She does prioritize her own dreams rather than
Mhm.
her relationship with
Mm.
him.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Borge, you have anything to
yeah,
say with that?
regarding that one, I was about to say, yeah, dovetailing on that idea about Eros as something that suspends time. To an extent, Eros is also something destructive. Eros as
Mm.
a form of attachment is about consuming the other. So,
Kojev?
and that's one thing. If love is to be a civic virtue, let's just call it. If love is supposed to be a civic virtue, it is also vulnerable to such delusions that you can mistake Eros for actual love. So that's one thing.
Mm.
It's also vulnerable to
Right.
such delusions. Yeah. But yeah, it should be.
So
I think
what is love?
it should
Yeah.
be.
If not eros, romantic love, what is love that for you or that is conducive as a civic virtue?
Yeah, Eros would be there as well. It's part of the package. But again, friendship would be there. Creative
Mm-hmm.
freedom, as From would highlight. Wag mo nga sakalin.
Mm-hmm.
But not only about wag mong sakalin, pero
Yeah.
kailangan mo rin tulungang lumaki or
Mm.
help the other person grow. So yeah.
Huh. That was dangerously close to being censored. Tulungan mo pala lumaki.
Oy,
It's
walang mali siya, walang mali siya.
yeah, walang mali siya, walang mali siya.
Kasama yan,
But
kasama
it's
rin yun.
funny. Yeah, I mean, to go back to the Janus's point, I think that's one thing in the tension of the film. They're using the relationship as a tool of power, right, of controlling the other. So I think that's what the pattern that Janus is pointing out throughout the film. That it's that love should not be an obstacle for freedom. In fact, it should set you free. So that's a very common thing. I think we should reserve this for for Valentine's Day, not
Well, now we have a
and not
topic for
well,
next year.
Yeah.
oh, maybe, and hopefully Janice might come back. Okay, for that. Um, okay, this is well, maybe just another question before we wrap this up. Do you have any pegs with regards to like people looking into films? Because I think personally your work reminds me of Slavoj Žižek's writing on films. Like he uses it to expose ideology. He uses Taxi Driver, Titanic, similar, like, and he reveals patron-client relations, class relations, etc. So I was wondering, like, do you have any models, or are you can you claim that you're an original Janusian thinker when you look at these films? Like, oh, maybe what's your framework for this?
I haven't really thought about this really in
Mm-hmm.
detail. No? So
Mm-hmm.
it's just something that I observe. Basically the connection between literature and society. There are a lot of theories about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I just try to see the connection between this seemingly, because what's the thing about rom-coms is that what's so really amazing, remarkable about them sometimes is they don't really have to talk about politics literally in
Mm-hmm.
order to make a political point. That's something that it's really, for me, what happens is rom-coms are just really two people talking, most of the time in a
Right.
film. But even if it's just these two people, they can really be, they can really be political, no? Especially if you pay attention to certain lines. Uh,
Mm.
yeah, of course,
Right.
each film naman is really political, but
Hmm.
and I should say that watching rom-coms and for example,
Mm.
Love Di, Kidlat Tahimik or Lino Broca, it's not mutually
Mm-hmm.
exclusive. You can watch
Mm-hmm.
both and appreciate both.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the thing is, rom-coms are, ano naman kasi, it's a projection of everyday life. And in everyday life, you would always find the public or public affairs, one way or
Mm-hmm.
another. Hindi naman siguro utterly highlighted the may political
Yeah.
aspect, but you can still find it. And again, we need,
Of course.
as Janus is advocating, we need a more focused eyesight or a more nuanced approach to such films.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, the thing about us in the rom-coms, we use these love stories as a vehicle to explore political questions. Maybe that's
Mm.
Mm.
a way of putting it, no?
Mm.
I mean, we can
Such
always
as.
political, the question of equality, freedom, and all of these things, So you could
Uh-huh.
argue that the relationships depicted in the rom-coms,
Mm.
you could read them as allegories.
Ah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that's the really intriguing part. You see why and how is it that these political questions are reflected in
Mm-hmm.
this story. So maybe
All
that's
right.
an interesting point to pursue. How
Right.
love is really, at least in the Philippines, or perhaps
Mm-hmm.
elsewhere, it's really a medium through which
Mm-hmm.
Filipinos and Philippine society, addresses political questions. And we don't necessarily have to depict rallies and all of
Mm.
this
Mm.
to be political.
Yeah. Right. All right. So I suppose let's make this last question before we let you go, which there's a lot to unpack and you've given us so much. But
Mm.
one last thing for our audiences who are is wondering, like, okay, what tips can you offer ordinary Filipino audiences who are struggling to see the deeper relevance in these rom-coms when they really they might say that, "Ah, but it's not my thing," even they don't even watch foreign rom-coms. So what tips would you give them for appreciating Filipino films?
Well, I think I mentioned it just a while ago. I think we have to expect that to see the value in these films, at least from a political perspective. First, I think we shouldn't really expect we shouldn't expect rom-coms to our films to literally depict political affairs in order to be
Hmm.
political. I think that's one
Hmm.
step towards seeing
Right.
the value of, as the feminists say, the personal is political. So even if it's just two people, there's a lot going on here, no?
Hmm.
So even, especially when you pay attention to the lines,
Mm.
because normally we tend to dismiss rom-coms as formulaic. It's always
Hmm.
the guy and the
Hmm.
but we miss these particular lines. Because we have to appreciate also the work of the screenplay. I mean, the writer
Uh-huh.
of the film, no? Because it's not just something that it's not just, of course, the films are produced by many studios, so there's a profit motive involved,
Hmm.
but the screenwriter, the screenplay, it still embodies somewhat the thoughts of the writer, no? So that's
Mm.
Hmm.
where, I mean, why is it that he or she has to include these lines? Why include this
Mm.
scene? You have
Hmm.
to ask these questions then,
Hmm.
and
Mm.
not
Right.
just and not let the formulas or the
Hmm.
genre itself, we should not let those obscure, these things, because people wrote this, and why is it that they wrote it this way?
Mm.
Hmm.
Why do we have to depict lines like this?
Hmm.
That in itself is already an interesting research question. Why
Mm.
are
Right.
the way they are? And I hope what I mentioned is part of answering that question.
Mm.
Mm.
Anything else to add, Borge?
No, 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 no.
All right. That's I think it's wonderful. Way to end this first interview version of our podcast. So thank you very much, Janice. But we have given us a lot to think about. But right now, let's move on to recommendations, where we and our guest recommend maybe a film, a work of fiction, art, or whatever to supplement this talk. So let's let the guest go first.
Yep.
What recommendation can you give our audience?
Well, I think one of the main audiences, not the audience of these rom-coms, are the millennials, no?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So I would say that we have to read up on the millennials in order to
Okay.
understand these films. And actually, we have to really observe what's happening in the Philippines today. These really rom-coms, these movies have emerged alongside certain trends kasi, in Philippine
Mm-hmm.
society. The rise of the service sector, the decline in marriages. I have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of stats here if you need to. So,
Mm-hmm.
but and then for a book, because my concern with rom-coms has to do with the status of Pinoy popular culture, no?
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Philippine culture in general. So, in this respect, I recommend Resil Mojares' The Origins and Rise of the Filipino Novel.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So, which is a serious scholarly attempt to deal with the subject.
Mm-hmm.
We can always talk about Jane Austen, but not really
Mm.
the Filipino novel,
Mm.
which is,
Mm.
I mean, it's okay to read Jane Austen, but somewhat it's saddening to know that many of us do not really know or are familiar with the Filipino novels. But in particular,
Mhm.
I do recommend the writings of Soledad Reyes on Filipino
Mm.
popular culture, especially the popular Tagalog novels from the early 20th century.
Mhm.
So in an age where we are bombarded by foreign shows and films on Netflix, we can easily forget the Philippines' rich traditions of popular culture, then and now. I admire her work for many reasons, but I think from the point of view of the 21st century, she has helped preserve a tradition or a culture that
Mhm.
I feel is forgotten, or at least largely underappreciated today.
Mhm.
Generally speaking,
Mm.
there is a sense in which the more we press forward into the future, there is also an ever-present tendency to look back.
Mm.
Mhm.
Reading her work can help us make sense of Filipinos' concerns in their history. Because when you look back at these films,
Mm.
you see that many of the issues that they deal with are still present today.
Mhm.
And while I feel there's nothing wrong with studying Europe or the West or
Mhm.
Western novels, Jane Austen, Charles
Mhm.
Dickens, I do think that all Filipinos have to have some familiarity with this body of work.
Mm. Yes. Okay. Borge, do you have any recommendations?
Oh yeah. Okay, okay. I think I'll just recommend the movie Isang Dang Tula para kay Stella.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Why that one, Borge?
And
That's
I think
awfully romantic of you.
the thing is earlier on you mentioned the notion of a post rom-com thing, or inversing the rom-com genre, and I think that movie would be an example of
Hmm.
which may call something, the values that one can get, the emotions that one can evoke out of a sad ending.
Mm,
So,
yes.
and of course it explores the notion of obsession, so on and so forth.
Uh-huh.
Trying to get someone that is by Fortuna's hand cannot be yours. So yeah,
Ooh.
that's my take
Hugot,
on it.
hugot. Right. All right. And I have one, but I'm not sure if you can find it. But there's this one book that made take Filipino films seriously in particular. This is the work of Rolando Tolentino, who has written extensively on Philippine popular culture. But the particular book, I hope you can find it. But the last time I found it was years ago in National Bookstore, wherein the cover was Richard Gomez, na topless, and is medyo mas maintingin sa akin ng cashier. But the title is Richard Gomez at ang mito ng pagkalalaki, Sharon Cuneta at ang perpetual na birhen at iba pang sanaysay ukol sa bida sa pelikula bilang kultural na teksto. So it's basically movie actors as cultural texts, and he goes each one, even Chris Aquino, Sharon Cuneta, Robin Padilla, etc. So he looks at it through lenses of gender, class, etc. But in case you can't find it, then you can just search and Shopee and Lazada any book by Rolando Tolentino, and he'll open your eyes to the deeper meaning of Philippine popular culture. So anything. So he's basically the author for popular culture. Well, hopefully, maybe Janus might contribute his own. Maybe be in the
In
running
time.
in time. And that's it. That is episode 7, our first interview. And I think we definitely appreciate you coming
Yep.
by. Thank you
Ooh.
very
Maraming
much.
salamat.
And hopefully, this won't be your last. So thank you very much, Janus.
Sure. Thank you, then.
So hopefully you'll join us. Please send in your questions or rate us on iTunes. It will help us a lot. Or maybe send us through email, or maybe in our Ask FM, or in our
Facebook
wherever you
page.
are. Maybe talk to us personally.
Yep.
So yeah, and thank you for joining us. And until then,
Magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.
if you enjoy the jazzy tunes of this podcast, you can find similar works with John Victor Ordonez of the band John's Dirty Old Sneakers at Spotify and SoundCloud. The logo and design were done by Shin Miyamoto and Anthony Borja.